Valle. We are here in Paris, in this garden of Swedish Institute. We're here on a mission, actually. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, but the plan is to make a series of interviews, first here in France and then in Germany next year, which are like provisionally entitled The States of Philosophy, the États de la Philosophie, which would deal with the states in plural of philosophy. I mean, where is philosophy going today? What are the new problems and new tendencies? And so that's really open-ended. It's really based on some kind of curiosity. What is actually going on today? So we're starting out. We did the first interview yesterday, and we're going to continue with this.
Mm-hmm. And as we are here in France, is there something really as known as French philosophy?
Yeah.
I know it is, but what does that mean?
Yeah, well, it's really a coincidence. It wasn't planned, but yesterday we interviewed Frédéric Worms, who is a professor at the École Normale Supérieure, and I was invited to a seminar after the interview, which was the final seminar of an organization that was founded by Alain Badiou in 2002, and Frédéric has been director of it since 2004. He's just stepping down. It's called, a rough translation would be the Institute for the let's see what it was really. It's a Center for the International Studies of French Contemporary Philosophy. So, which has been going on now for more than 20 years. And the discussion was really about what is French? What is French philosophy? So, your question is somehow very timely because we had a long discussion about that yesterday. And I guess seen from the outside, from Sweden or US or Germany or England, whatever, there is an entity called French philosophy, which is like French somehow. And if you're inside France, it's a really different thing, because many of the thinkers and writers that are known in France aren't that known outside. So obviously it's a much more diverse picture if you're inside France. But I would say there are two answers. Both of them insufficient, but still, and I don't know if you can just add them together, but there are two books that I've been tempted. Of course, there are many books, but there are two books that have attempted to define something like French philosophy. And the first one is the more recent one by Etienne Balibar, who is a French philosopher, and John Reichman from New York, an American philosopher. It's called French Philosophy since 1945. And we actually reviewed that book in Sight like 10 years ago. Fredrika did that, so we're going to republish that review. Very good review.
We should.
And so that book starts with 1945, which is of course the end of the Second World War, but it also, I think, does so because in order to present a certain picture of French philosophy, and they begin with the idea of the subject and the concept. That is, a philosophy based in experience, in subjectivity, or a philosophy based in conceptual work, which is a certain French tradition. And they do that, I think, or I'm pretty sure, in order to somehow evacuate the other story, which begins earlier in 1933. And this is a book that is much older. It was written in French in 1978, I think, but then translated the year after, and it was, largely oriented towards the Anglo-Saxon audience. So it's called in French The Same and the Other. In English, it had a more, as it were, commercially viable title, Modern French Philosophy, which is more easily accessible. But it begins with 1933 for a particular reason. And I wanted to bring up that in the discussion yesterday, but I didn't do it because it sounded, perhaps they've been over this 100 times, but in some sense you could say that what we recognize as modern French philosophy is the result of two immigrants from Eastern Europe. It's Alexander Kochev, who's a Russian immigrant, and Imre Levinas, who is a Lithuanian immigrant. Both of them have been, as it were, been grown up in the French language, but still they come from outside. And if we begin with Kochev, he did courses on Hegel from 1933 to 1939 at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, I think, yes. And he introduced Hegel. Earlier French philosophy was largely based in a certain kind of rationalism, neo-Kantianism, a certain theory of science. And his introduction of Hegel, his was really a reading of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Introduced concepts like desire, labor, with the body. it made philosophy concrete in a certain way. It shouldn't just deal with scientific rationality, but it should engage with human experience and also in all of its political and revolutionary facets. So in that sense, he wanted to bring philosophy down to the concrete. And obviously, Hegel is a pretty abstract thinker, but his reading of Hegel was very influential, and because he also mainly, or the most important part of his lectures were on Hegel's section in the phenomenology on the dialectic of the master and the slave, which deals with the idea that in order to be self-conscious, you need to have a relation to someone else. Mm-hmm. And that relation will begin by being asymmetrical. There's someone who subjugates the other, and this relation is overturned gradually. So there's always a conflict and a kind of dissonance, but also violence and desire involved in relation to the other, but also in relation to yourself. So all kind of consciousness is always a kind of drama of subjectivity. And everyone was there, Sartre, Raymond Aron, Georges Bataille. Bataille was enormously influenced by that, although some people say that he actually fell asleep during the entire lectures. He never heard anything. We don't know. I mean, there's a lot of myths of who were actually there. But anyway, ideally speaking, virtually all of the people that would emerge after the war as important philosophers were present at Kochev's lectures. And this is how Hegel came into the picture. And his reading of Hegel was also influenced by Heidegger, because he emphasized the moment of death and negativity and finitude in Hegel. So it was a kind of amalgamation of Hegel and Heidegger and Marx to some extent. So that was somehow crucial for the development of post-war French theory. The other thinker whose impact here has been forgotten, I think, is Emmanuel Levinas, who's mainly known for his work on ethics in the 1960s and onward. But he introduced, in fact, Husserl, the other phenomenologist in France, because Husserl gave a series of lectures at the Sorbonne, which were called Cartesian Meditations. And he gave a talk in German. I don't think any French person would have understood him. But Levinas, together with Gabriel Pfeiffer, translated that book in 1931. Mm-hmm. It was out in French, called Méditation cartésienne. And after, it's just a curious aside, after that, Husserl's manuscript was lost. So for a long time, the only text was the French translation of Méditation cartésienne. Oh, wow. So Husserl was introduced there. And here too you find the relationship to the other, and it's not about violence and subjugation, but the other is important. So this triad, Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, les trois grands H, the three great H's, as it were, this trio is the effect of Kochev and Levinas. And that was tremendously important after the war. And people like Sartre, Simone Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and many others who were first known as existentialists would be better described as existential phenomenologists, because they all drew on Hegel, Husserl, and Heidegger, and they continued this quest for the concrete, for the ordinary. And it was a question of, how shall I put it, in Husserl's case, phenomenology was a kind of transcendental philosophy. It was a idea that you should lay a foundation for the sciences, mathematics, logic, and the natural sciences, but also the social and human sciences. But after the war, perhaps through Heidegger, that motive receded a bit, and phenomenology became the exploration of everyday experience. It could include things like, what does it mean to have insomnia, to love someone, to be anxious, so phenomenology became a very, very broad field of exploration that would include science, but not having science as one of its, as it were, primary objects. And this is also because many of these thinkers were also important writers. Simone Beauvoir was an author, and Sartre, even more famous, even got the Nobel Prize. So the idea of philosophy as a kind of writing in the sense that philosophy merges with literature to some extent, was very predominant then. And this also means that, I think this is general for all French philosophy, that there is this kind of open frontiers between the literary and the philosophical, all kinds of writing, and the French philosopher will immediately go from really abstract discussions about concepts to very concrete situations. So it's a kind of literary form that French philosophy is, not always, but largely recognizable by its introduction of literary motives, I think. Mm-hmm. So I mean, this is, as you call, the phenomenological tradition, and this begins in 1933. And when Etienne and John did the book in 45, they begin in 45 with the subject and the concept. And they simply evacuate this thing before the war. And they do that because they have a different take on philosophy, which is the other side of French philosophy, which is less known outside of France. It's beginning to be known now, but there is actually a very strong French philosophy of science, which comes from a historical tradition going back to Pierre Duhem at the beginning of the century and moving through Gaston Bachelard, Georges Canguilhem and many others that explore how scientific concepts are formed in history. And it's really not, you know, if you look at Anglo-Saxon philosophy of science from logical positivism and onward, it is about defining the ultimate ground of rationality. What does it mean to do science in a rational way? You find that in early logical positivism, in Popper and many others. The French tradition has I would say, slightly different emphasis. It's about how sciences change. It's about this idea of epistemological breaks and cuts and ruptures in Bachelard and Canguilhem. So the French, I wouldn't say that the French philosophy of science is against rationality. That would be silly, but it's a way of pluralizing and thinking rationality as event and structure and difference. So in that sense, the work on the concept is the other side of French philosophy. And which one of the two would be the most important one? It depends on from what vantage point you're looking at. Decombe was looking at the subject side, phenomenology, and Etienne and Jean were looking at the concept side, and this is a kind of struggle that goes on forever, that will go on. And I think today there's a lot of, after people like Alain Badiou, for instance, that I mentioned, who founded this, this Center for the Study of French Philosophy in 2002, he said French philosophy can be defined as something which is neither analytic philosophy nor phenomenology. And that would basically be himself. He's describing himself. Because of course, that's how people do philosophy, they describe themselves. But still, it's of course too narrow. Saying that French philosophy is not phenomenology is simply absurd, because the largest part of French philosophy after the war, up to the mid-60s, late 60s, was phenomenological influence to a great extent. So, but I think this tradition of epistemology and defining science as cut and rupture and break is becoming more and more visible today after the work of Badiou. And I have my problems, my misgivings with Alain Badiou for many reasons, but still he's a very important thinker. And I think a lot of what I've recently seen, and we will meet some of them later on in our interviews, are now claiming we must do metaphysics again. Metaphysics, whatever that is, it's it's a strange word, but in the phenomenological tradition coming from Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger, as it was evolving in France, largely was claimed that metaphysics had come to an end. We should somehow distrust the great systems. We should definitely read them as a really historical interpretation, but we must read them in order to dismantle them or deconstruct them, as Derrida said. Now people are saying we must stop this. We must construct. We must produce new metaphysics.
Yeah, it's like a backlash.
Yeah, it's a backlash, and it goes back and forth. And then, of course, this new metaphysics, the same thing happens in analytic philosophy, really, because after Wittgenstein, for instance, now Wittgenstein would say that these old metaphysical systems are gone, in his philosophical investigations after the war, the thing called the linguistic turn, which is very similar to what happened in France. After Wittgenstein, people would say the old metaphysics is just dead. Philosophical issues can be somehow solved by going back to everyday language, how we speak, how we interact, and the questions of body and mind and soul and God and affinity, they are no longer making any sense. But today, we did an early interview with Martin Gustafsson, the Swedish philosopher, who is now retranslated some parts of Wittgenstein, the philosophical investigations. He was saying that interview, if I remember correctly, that metaphysics is back, but it's connected to the sciences strongly. This is why, for instance, the mind-body problem would seem to be a traditional metaphysical problem. It's now being solved by reference to biology or neuroscience or something else. So metaphysical questions are back, but they're being strongly referred to the natural sciences. This is to some extent the case in France, but I'd say it's what they're trying to do, like Quentin Meillassoux and Tristan Garcia and others, are trying to produce new metaphysics without that strong tie to the natural sciences. And the question is, of course, what kind of metaphysics would that be? And so in that sense, there's big gamut of movements today, and this phenomenological movement is still strong, but is being opposed by this metaphysical movement, which goes back to the work on the concept. So I think how one writes the history of French philosophy is largely dependent on what position you take today. And for someone like, for instance, Bergson, the first modern French philosopher in the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Bergson would be not really part of this phenomenological story, which begins in the 30s, but he would be more part of this epistemological tradition. I would say perhaps because Gilles Deleuze wrote a very important book on him in 1966, Le Bergsonisme. So I mean, the story is rewritten over and over again, and it's perhaps you can say it's a French thing to worry about history. In the sense that
because Germans don't do that.
yeah, of course, because of other things. But I mean, to worry about the history of their own philosophy.
Yeah, no.
Because German philosophy was always German. I mean, that's intriguing. I mean, German philosophy is Kant, Hegel, the Romantics, and Nietzsche, the Marx and Freud, and Husserl, Heidegger, Adorno, whatnot, Benjamin, and now it's Habermas, and they open up very much towards analytic philosophy in Germany today. But it was always German. I mean, for instance, I say, what is intriguing about French philosophy, if one looks at the story that begins in 1933, which has not to do with Hitler in 1933, I should not say that, but is that French philosophy, at least in that genealogy, was largely defined by its relation to other philosophies. It was a way of reinterpreting German philosophy. So the French philosophy began by reacting to and rereading German philosophers like Hegel, Husserl, Heidegger,
exactly,
Kant.
yeah.
Whereas the Germans, they somehow never read the French. I mean, none of the important German philosophers in the 20s and 30s after the war, they almost never referred to French philosophy. You get someone like Adorno, he perused some Bergson, he didn't know, maybe some Sartre, he never read Merleau-Ponty, he was unaware of Lacan, he didn't know anything. So the Germans have much more solid traditions, so they don't worry so much about it. Whereas the French have continued to redefine themselves, because they have, at least in one of the genealogies, they are defined by this relation to the exterior. And I think this is crucial. I mean, at least in my humble experience, coming out of the Swedish context, which was, still is predominantly analytical, started off by reading German philosophers, but then I always found that the French reading of the Germans was much more interesting, because the French had this critical and creative and inventive reading of German philosophy that also pushed it out of academia a little bit, whereas the German reading was intra-academic and slightly boring. So I remember once I was in the 80s at the Heidegger Society in Freiburg, the Heidegger Gesellschaft, and I heard all these German people speaking about Heidegger. It was horrible. I have nothing against Heidegger. I've translated, read lots of Heidegger. But the sense of slightly right-wing conservative attitude, and it was like, God, this is oppressive. This is not funny.
Nationalistic.
Well, not nationalistic, because that's of course impossible in German. But there was a sense, that the French reading was not acceptable. And I remember one guy speaking. I remember who it was now. He said he was circling around certain themes about, there are certain readings. This is like the mid-'80s. There are certain readings we all know. But okay, who are you referring to? He said, after like 40 minutes of lectures, okay, I say the name, Jacques Derrida. Oh my God, there it was. Because the French reading was considered wild, unacceptable, and crazy. And I remember saying, I have to leave this. I remember taking the train from Freiburg to Paris and coming here and going to Collège International de Philosophie and saying, thank God I'm here. Because so in some sense, the best part of German philosophy moved to France.
Right.
And this, of course, creates an anxiety, But I think, so this is one side. The other side, this tradition of the concept and history of science, they do not refer to the Germans.
Sorry?
They at all, not completely, but they rarely refer to the German tradition.
Right.
So it's also a question about how to relate to the German influence and the society, or this style of the French philosophy. When I hear them define French philosophy, it's really not about the connection to Germany. Okay. So in that sense, it's a kind of national drama, I think, which goes on, which is not the case in Germany at all. So in that sense, I mean, the states of philosophy is also, the philosophy of the national states and the countries and so on and so on.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because, as many others, I've heard the story that French philosophy is an invention from the United States.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah, that's later, because I mean, I think this is because of the event of structuralism and then this strange compound called post-structuralism that happened in the 60s. A lot of French philosophers were introduced through comp lit and literary studies in the US, not really through philosophy departments, because that was still largely analytical, but through the humanities, and people like Foucault and Derrida and Lacan and others were introduced as some kind of French theory. And then that came back, and because of the influence of America and of course of the English language as such, suddenly there emerged this thing called French theory, which is an American invention, but that's not part of the earliest part of the 19th century, but it's from the 60s and 70s and onwards. And then we get something in Sweden back called French philosophy, which is also filtered through the Anglo-Saxon interpretation of it.
Yes.
So in that sense, there are all these national idioms that cross and combine in different ways. Yeah, it's very interesting, and interesting to see how this interview series will go, because we've been trying to find different positions in that field. We'll see if we succeed, but it's an ongoing drama, I would say.
Yeah, and we also had some cancellations, so let's see.
Let's see how it goes.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to.